It doesn't register as anger at first. It registers as disorientation. The idea that doctors misled you for years doesn't land like betrayal. It lands like a missing alignment finally snapping into place. Symptoms that never fully explain themselves. Answers that felt technically correct but emotionally incomplete. A sense that something was always being managed rather than understood. You lived inside that gap quietly. You followed instructions. You trusted systems designed to interpret bodies, minds, limit. Yet something in you remained unconvinced. Not defiant, just alert. You noticed how certainty arrived too quickly. How explanations closed conversations instead of opening clarity. How your lived experience was often reduced to categories that felt too narrow to hold it. Misled here is symbolic. It doesn't mean deliberate harm. It means oversimplification. Systems often mistake complexity for error. When something doesn't respond predictably, it's labeled, controlled, contained. You felt this containment early. Not as pain, but as a subtle pressure to accept conclusions that didn't fully account for how you actually functioned. You may remember how you learned to describe yourself carefully, how you edited language to fit expectations, how you learned which symptoms were acceptable to mention and which would derail the conversation. This wasn't deception, it was adaptation. You understood intuitively that some truths, shared too directly, would be misunderstood or dismissed. Over time, this shaped your relationship with authority. You didn't reject it outright. You listened. You complied. But you never fully surrendered discernment. You carried a quiet sense that the story being told about you was incomplete, that what you experienced internally required a different framework than the one being applied. Doctors represent expertise, legitimacy, explanation. When that explanation doesn't resonate, doubt doesn't erupt, it waits. You waited. You observed. You noticed patterns over years rather than moments. You paid attention to what changed and what didn't. That long observation refined your awareness far beyond any single diagnosis or opinion. You might recall moments when improvement felt accidental rather than intentional. When relief came from adjustments you made yourself, not from prescribed solutions. These moments didn't invalidate the system, but they exposed its limits. You began to understand that being understood and being treated are not always the same thing. This realization doesn't lead to rebellion. It leads to recalibration. You stop outsourcing authority over your experience entirely. You begin integrating external guidance with internal data. You listen differently now. You ask different questions. You trust patterns over proclamations. The story doesn't move toward accusation. It moves toward agency, toward recognizing that years of being misled didn't weaken you. They trained you to observe without panic, to endure uncertainty without collapsing, to remain functional while clarity matured slowly. As this settles, a deeper awareness emerges. What was delayed wasn't healing, it was interpretation. And interpretation changes everything once it catches up. The narrative begins here. Not with blame, but with the moment you realize your experience was always more accurate than the explanations surrounding it. As agency begins to return, you notice how carefully you had been managing yourself for others. Not lying, filtering. You learned which questions would shorten appointments and which would open confusion. You sensed when your experience was being translated into something easier to record, easier to conclude, easier to close. And so you adjusted, not to deceive, but to survive the interaction intact. This prolonged filtering trained you in a skill few people develop consciously: self-observation without external confirmation. You learned to notice how your body responded over time, not just to interventions, but to environments, stress, rhythm, and rest. You tracked subtle changes others would dismiss. You recognized patterns that didn't fit charts but fit you. This wasn't paranoia. It was longitudinal awareness. You may recall how often reassurance felt hollow. How everything looks normal didn't settle the dissonance you felt internally. Normal became a word that explained away discomfort rather than addressing it. Yet you didn't spiral. You stored the inconsistency. You waited. You let evidence accumulate quietly instead of forcing conclusions. That patience preserved clarity. Being misled for years doesn't only affect trust in systems. It reshapes trust in self. At first, it weakens it. You question your perception. You wonder if sensitivity equals exaggeration. But over time, something reverses. You realize that your perception was consistent even when interpretations changed. That consistency becomes your anchor. You might notice how this altered your relationship with certainty. You don't rush toward it. You don't reject it either. You treat it as provisional, useful, but incomplete. This makes you harder to misdirect now. You listen carefully, but you don't outsource judgment. You integrate information instead of absorbing it whole. There's also a quiet resilience that formed here. Years of partial explanations didn't stop you from functioning. You continued to work, relate, adapt. You learned to carry ambiguity without dramatizing it. That capacity now serves you far beyond the original context. It shows up in how you handle complex decisions, unclear outcomes, and delayed results. This phase reframes the past not as wasted time, but as training. You were learning how to stay oriented when authority speaks with confidence but incomplete understanding. You were learning how to keep your internal compass active even when external signals were inconsistent. As this awareness settles, the story shifts again. It's no longer about what was said or unsaid. It's about how you move now that you understand the difference between explanation and truth. Truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits until you're strong enough to carry it without needing permission. Once you recognize the gap between explanation and truth, something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop trying to be convinced. You still listen, you still gather input, but you no longer wait for certainty to be granted from outside. Your experience becomes data again, not a problem to be corrected. You may notice how this changes your posture in conversations with authority. You're calmer, more precise. You ask fewer questions, but better ones. You don't seek reassurance, you seek clarity. And when clarity isn't available, you don't panic. You note it. You file it. You move on without surrendering your orientation. Years of being misled refined your tolerance for ambiguity. Where others become anxious without answers, you remain functional. You learned how to live forward while understanding lags behind. That skill is rare. It allows you to progress without forcing resolution prematurely. It keeps you from being captured by incomplete narrative. You might reflect on how often you sensed improvement before anyone confirmed it. How your body signaled shifts long before metrics caught up. Those moments trained you to trust trajectory rather than snapshot. You stopped obsessing over isolated data points and started observing patterns across time. This long-view perception protects you from overreaction and false hope alike. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. This also reshaped how you respond to doubt. When uncertainty arises now, you don't interpret it as failure. You interpret it as a signal that information is incomplete. That distinction prevents collapse. It keeps curiosity alive without letting anxiety take control. You remain engaged rather than defensive. You may realize that what once felt like dismissal forced you to become articulate internally. You learned how to separate sensation from interpretation, reaction from response. You didn't have the luxury of dramatizing your experience, you had to understand it. That necessity sharpened your awareness more effectively than validation ever could. As this phase stabilizes, trust in yourself returns, not as confidence but as reliability. You know how you respond under pressure. You know when something is off, even if you can't name it yet. You know how to adjust without overcorrecting. This self-trust doesn't shout. It operates quietly. The narrative is no longer about being misled. It's about what that misdirection produced. You didn't become suspicious. You became discerning. You didn't become rigid. You became adaptive. You didn't lose faith in systems, you learned their limit. And that understanding changes how you move through the world now. You don't reject guidance. You contextualize it. You don't deny expertise. You integrate it with lived evidence. You hold authority and experience in the same frame without letting either dominate. The next movement will bring this discernment into focus, showing how it reshapes not just how you understand yourself, but how you navigate every system that claims to define you. Discernment doesn't stay confined to one system. Once learned, it migrates. You begin to notice how the same pattern appears elsewhere. Institutions that speak with confidence but operate on incomplete maps. Authorities that manage outcomes without fully understanding the individual inside them. What once felt personal now reads as structural. You no longer take certainty at face value. Not with cynicism, but with calibration. You listen for what's included and what's absent. You notice how quickly conversations close once a label is applied. How complexity is often treated as inconvenience. This awareness doesn't make you oppositional. It makes you selective about where you place trust. You may realize that this is why you've always resisted being summarized. Titles, categories, and simplified narratives never fit you cleanly. You've lived inside systems long enough to know that reduction is often a form of control. Not malicious, but efficient. And efficiency rarely favors nuance. You learn to protect nuance quietly. This shows up now in how you navigate work, relationships, and expectations. You don't accept frameworks blindly. You test them against reality. You ask whether they work rather than whether they're authoritative. This doesn't isolate you, it sharpens collaboration. You become someone who improves systems without needing to challenge them loudly. You might notice how others respond to this. Some feel unsettled by your questions. Others feel relieved. You don't attack assumptions. You expose their edges. You don't dismantle structures. You reveal where they're incomplete. That ability is valuable precisely because it's not dramatic. It preserves function while allowing correction. There's also a deeper self-compassion that emerges here. You stop blaming yourself for not fitting explanations that were never designed to hold you. You understand now that misinterpretation wasn't failure. It was mismatch. And mismatch doesn't require fixing the individual. It requires updating the model. This realization frees you from unnecessary self-monitoring. You don't constantly check whether you're doing it right. You focus on whether you're responding accurately. Accuracy replaces approval as your metric. This shift reduces anxiety and increases effectiveness across every domain of your life. As this phase settles, the story sheds another layer of tension. You're no longer trying to reconcile yourself with systems that misunderstood you. You're building a way of moving that works regardless of whether systems fully catch up. That independence isn't isolation. It's resilience. The narrative continues now, not toward confrontation, but toward integration. How do you remain engaged with imperfect systems without surrendering your discernment? How do you apply what you've learned without becoming rigid or distrustful? Those answers come next, not as rules but as lived adjustments. Integration begins when resistance softens into fluency. You stop bracing against systems that once misread you and start moving through them with informed flexibility. You no longer expect perfect understanding. You expect function. And when function is missing, you compensate intelligently instead of emotionally. You may notice how this changes your behavior in structured environments. You speak with clarity, but you don't over-explain. You comply where it makes sense, and you adapt where it doesn't. You don't announce your discernment, you apply it. This keeps interactions clean and preserves your energy. You're no longer fighting misinterpretation. You're navigating around it. Years of being misled taught you how to separate intent from outcome. You understand now that many systems aim to help but operate with incomplete lenses. This insight prevents bitterness. You don't personalize limitation. You contextualize it. That perspective allows you to remain cooperative without becoming dependent. You might reflect on how your decision-making has matured. You don't look for single sources of truth anymore. You triangulate. You observe. You wait for patterns to repeat before acting decisively. This method takes patience, but it produces accuracy. You're rarely surprised now, not because you predict everything, but because you prepare for variability. This integration also reshapes your confidence. It's no longer reactive. You don't need to defend your experience or convince others of its validity. You trust what you've observed over time. That trust frees you to engage without tension. You're present, but not vulnerable to being overridden. You may notice that people respond differently to you now. They sense your steadiness. They sense that you won't collapse under uncertainty or inflate under reassurance. This makes collaboration easier. Others may not understand why you're reliable, but they feel it. Reliability becomes your quiet credential. As integration settles, the narrative shifts again. The story is no longer about what was wrong with the past. It's about what was built because of it. You didn't lose years. You gained a framework that allows you to operate effectively in complex, imperfect environments. The misdirection did its work. It trained discernment. It cultivated patience. It anchored self-trust. And now that training is active, not theoretical, you're using it daily, often without thinking about it. The next movement will take this integration further, showing how discernment, once internal, begins to shape not just how you move, but how others move around you. Once discernment becomes visible in action, it begins to influence the environment quietly. Not by instruction, not by challenge, but by example. People adjust their expectations around you. Conversations become more precise. Decisions slow just enough to become accurate. This isn't authority asserted, it's coherence felt. You may notice how others seek your input differently now. Not for reassurance, but for orientation. They don't ask you to decide for them. They ask you to clarify. Your questions matter more than your answers. You know how to locate the missing piece in a narrative without dismantling the whole structure. That skill changes outcomes without creating resistance. This is where years of being misled reveal their unexpected value. You learn to hear what wasn't being said, to sense when explanations were incomplete, to remain calm when certainty was overstated. These abilities now allow you to operate inside systems without being absorbed by them. You don't disappear into consensus, and you don't isolate yourself from it either. You might reflect on how this affects leadership, even when you're not in a formal role. People mirror your pacing. They reconsider assumptions when you pause. They become more thoughtful simply by sharing space with you. This isn't charisma. It's regulation. And regulation spreads naturally when someone holds it consistently. There's also a noticeable reduction in conflict around you. Not because disagreement vanishes, but because escalation loses momentum. You don't fuel it. You don't suppress it either. You let clarity drain excess charge from situations. This preserves relationships and protects progress simultaneously. As this phase settles, you realize that being misled didn't make you suspicious, it made you precise. You know how to stay open without being naive. You know how to respect expertise without surrendering perception. You know how to act decisively without pretending certainty where it doesn't exist. The narrative continues to narrow now, away from systems and toward impact. Not dramatic impact, but structural impact. How your way of moving creates stability beyond immediate outcomes. How discernment, once internal, becomes a quiet resource others rely on without naming it. The next movement will bring this to its fullest expression, showing how clarity sustains itself over time, even as conditions change. Sustained clarity reveals itself when conditions change and nothing essential shifts inside you. You notice this when pressure increases but your responses don't sharpen into rigidity. When uncertainty appears but your thinking doesn't fragment. This is where discernment proves it wasn't situational, it was structural. You may feel how your internal pace now sets the tempo of interaction. Others slow down when speaking with you. Assumptions are examined instead of rushed. Decisions are revisited without embarrassment. This isn't because you demand care, but because your presence makes care functional. You normalize thoughtfulness in environments that usually reward speed. Years of being misled trained you to remain patient without becoming passive. That balance is rare. Most people swing between compliance and resistance. You learned a third posture, observation with agency. You stay engaged while retaining freedom to adjust. This posture allows you to remain effective even when systems evolve slowly or inconsistently. You might notice how this affects long-term outcomes. Projects you touch don't unravel easily. Processes hold longer. People remember conversations with you not for what was decided, but for how clear things felt afterward. This clarity isn't dramatic, but it's durable. It reduces the need for correction later. There's also a deeper trust in timing that settles here. You don't rush to resolve ambiguity. You allow it to reveal itself through repetition. This patience prevents premature closure and protects against false certainty. You've learned that clarity often arrives not as an answer, but as alignment across multiple signals. As this phase stabilizes, you stop revisiting the question of whether you were misled. That question becomes irrelevant. What matters is that you now see clearly enough to move forward without distortion. The past trained your vision. The present uses it. You may sense a calm confidence that doesn't seek reinforcement. You're not waiting for validation. You're not guarding against doubt. You're operating from a position that has been tested quietly over time. That testing didn't break you, it refined you. The story narrows further now, approaching its close. Not with resolution, but with consolidation. What you learned has integrated fully into how you think, decide, and remain steady across change. Only two movements remain. One to show how this clarity protects you when stakes rise, and one to close the narrative without closing your forward motion. When stakes rise, clarity doesn't disappear, it simplifies. You notice how pressure no longer scatters your attention. It narrows it. You become more selective about what matters and more decisive about what doesn't. This isn't emotional hardening. It's filtration. Years of navigating incomplete explanations taught you how to protect signal from noise. You may feel how your body responds first. Breath steadies. Posture grounds. Thought follows. You don't rush to control outcomes. You stabilize conditions. That sequence matters. It prevents reaction from masquerading as action. Others sense this and adjust accordingly. Urgency loses its leverage around you. This is where your history becomes an asset rather than a reference. You've lived with uncertainty long enough to know it won't destroy you. You've operated inside systems that spoke confidently while missing key variables. So when complexity appears now, you don't panic. You map. You test. You move incrementally. Precision replaces intensity. You might notice how this protects relationships under stress. You don't assign blame prematurely. You don't demand clarity where none exists yet. You create space for facts to emerge without letting ambiguity turn into chaos. This keeps trust intact even when outcomes are unclear. People feel safer thinking alongside you. There's also a refined courage here. Not the courage to confront loudly, but the courage to wait when waiting is harder than acting. You allow incomplete narratives to remain open until evidence converges. This patience prevents costly errors. It also builds credibility. When you speak, it's because the picture has sharpened, not because silence became uncomfortable. As stakes increase, your discernment becomes more visible, but still not theatrical. You ask the question others avoid because it slows things down. You name the assumption everyone is stepping over. You do it calmly without accusation. That tone keeps the system receptive rather than defensive. You may realize now that being misled didn't teach you to distrust, it taught you to verify. Verification is respectful. It honors expertise while insisting on coherence. This balance allows you to engage high-stakes situations without alienating collaborators. You remain useful when others polarize. The narrative is nearly complete. What began as disorientation matured into agency, then discernment, then integration. Now it rests as protection. Protection of clarity. Protection of energy. Protection of outcomes that matter beyond immediate relief. One final movement remains. Not to elevate the lesson, but to release it fully into your life. To close the story so what it described can continue without narration. Release arrives quietly, the way clarity does when it no longer needs to announce itself. You don't feel resolved, you feel steady. The question of being misled dissolves because it no longer organizes your thinking. What organized you was the capacity you built in response. The ability to hold uncertainty without surrendering direction, to respect authority without abandoning perception, to act decisively without pretending certainty where it doesn't exist. You understand now that the years weren't taken from you. They were used. Used to refine attention. Used to teach you how to verify rather than absorb. Used to anchor trust in pattern instead of proclamation. This didn't harden you. It clarified you. And clarity is what allows movement without fragmentation. Nothing about your life requires confrontation with the past to move forward. You don't need to correct records or prove misinterpretation. You carry what works, and what works keeps working. The system you live by now is internal, portable, and resilient. It travels with you into any context without demanding accommodation. You notice how ordinary days feel lighter. Decisions don't echo. Doubt doesn't linger. When information is incomplete, you hold it without urgency. When clarity arrives, you move without drama. This rhythm preserves energy and protects outcomes. It's the opposite of control, it's proportion. The story ends here not because everything is known, but because you know how to proceed when it isn't. That competence replaces narrative. It replaces the need for explanation with the ability to continue. You don't need to remember every lesson to live them. They're embedded in how you pause, how you choose, how you remain present under pressure. If someone asks what changed, there's no single answer. Nothing dramatic happened. What happened was integration. Experience caught up to interpretation. Discernment became habit. Habit became structure. Structure became freedom. This is where the story lets go. Not to leave you without guidance, but to trust what you've built. You don't need a closing revelation. You need space to live accurately. And you have it. The past did its work. The present holds. The future doesn't need guarantees. What remains is usable. What's usable continues.